What's up, YouTube, you old bastard? Morning. So, another Stewart Lee reaction video here. This is a bit special for me because it's one of the first Stewart Lee clips that I ever watched. I was on a comedy writing course and we had to watch some comedy and analyse it. I don't remember exactly what I said. I'll try and think at the end. But here it is, Stewart Lee Diverticulitis.
What can I say that hasn't been said about this man before? There's nothing I can add, ladies and gentlemen, nothing I can add at all. Please welcome to the stage the grizzled form of comic sage, Stewart Lee!
Thanks very much. I'm Stewart Lee. I was ill last year and for the preceding 36 years. I had to go into hospital. I had this thing called diverticulitis. It's where your stomach kind of starts to poison you. Normally, only very old people get it, but if you've been a stand-up comedian for 37 years, drinking heavily and eating mainly ginsters pies in the night, that can kind of move it on. So I had to go into hospital, and while I was in there in North London, I had an endoscopy, right? That's where they insert a camera on a fibre optic tube into your anus. Now, on that occasion, it was my anus. But it would be your anus if it were you that were undergoing the endoscopy. Because in medical science, as a rule, there's a direct relationship between who's the subject of the procedure and the information the doctors are trying to find out. That's why you can't send a friend along instead. Even if they really love investigative surgery. It has to be you. Anything else is a frivolous waste of time. So I was in there, I was lying on a slab and I was naked except for one of those kind of third length floral print hospital gowns that go down to about there. Now, I've never understood the design of them because as a man I'm not ashamed of my breasts. What I want concealed are my genitals, my penis, my two testicles. They're the source of my shame. But the design of the third length floral print hospital gown makes it look as if I've chosen to expose them in a coquettish fashion. Which I would never do. I wouldn't do that. So
I would never do.
Wheeled into the endoscopy and I was lying on a slab, I was naked, a third length floral print hospital gown, and I had a fibre optic tube inserted into my lubricated anus. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, this is true, the doctor said to me, "Oh, I see from your notes that you are a famous comedian." And I said to him, "There's a problem with that sentence, isn't there, doctor? Which is that if the phrase, 'you are a famous comedian,' is preceded by the qualifying phrase, 'I see from your notes.'" No, I'm not anyway. And then the nurse interrupted rather aggressively. She went, "Well, I've never heard of you." As if it were I that had arrogantly introduced this vain and boastful notion into the endoscopic procedure, which hadn't done. I said, "Well, I am a comedian." And she said, "Well, you don't look like a comedian." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "A comedian should look funny." Now, at the time, I was lying on a slab in a third-length floral print hospital gown with a fibre optic tube inserted into my anus. If I'd seen that, I might have laughed. But I suppose if you work in endoscopy, you run the risk of becoming jaded. So I said to her, what do you mean a comedian should look funny? And she said to me, a comedian, she said, should be the sort of person, she said, that as soon as you look at them, she said, it makes you want to laugh, she said, like Joe Pasquale. So as I lay there naked in a third-length floral print hospital gown with a fibre optic tube inserted into my anus, looking at live video footage relay of my own bleeding and rotting internal organs, I thought about Joe Pasquale. And I've thought about Joe Pasquale once before in my life, and it was 10 years ago, right? And this is how it happened, okay? When I started doing comedy about 20 years ago, there used to be a comedian on the circuit in London called Michael Redmond. He was Irish. He lives in Glasgow now. And what he used to do was he used to have big bushy hair and a kind of droopy moustache and very deep-set eyes. And he always used to wear a long brown Mac and carry a little plastic bag. And he used to walk out and he would stand still in silence for about 2 minutes, looking really weird. And then he would say, a lot of people say to me, get out of my garden. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that is the greatest opening line ever. And not just to a comedy set, to anything. I don't think there's a book or a play or a film that couldn't be improved by having that as it... The book of Genesis would make a lot more sense if it just... It began like that and cut to the chase, you know.
Clever.
And it always used to get a really good laugh, that joke. But it got a much bigger laugh in 1995 when Joe Pasquale did it as one of his jokes in his Royal Variety Performance set of that year. And there's always been a kind of tradition of mainstream acts kind of borrowing our material. In fact, you might remember at the end of 2004, Jimmy Carr had to take Jim Davidson to task for stealing some of his material. Although, to be honest, if Jim Davidson can steal your material, maybe it's time to think about writing something else. Although, to be fair to Jimmy Carr, right, it was a kind of sexist bit that he'd written with a sense of irony that Jim Davidson was able to appropriate at face value. One of the kindest things you can say about Jim Davidson as a fellow comic is he's not a performer who is troubled by the possibility of duality of meaning. So I did this piece for a Sunday newspaper in '95 about this idea of material theft. And I rang up Joe Pasquale and I said to him, how did you think of that joke about the garden? And Joe Pasquale said, I thought if someone looked out of their window and they saw me in their garden, they would say, get out of my garden. Now that's not quite right, is it? Because if you looked out of your window and you saw Joe Pasquale in your garden, you'd just go, what's that? Joe Pasquale. In the garden. What can he possibly want? Because that joke only really works if an anonymous weirdo is saying it. As soon as you introduce a celebrity into it, it's structurally compromised. Well, it is, isn't it? You know. So I said to him, are you sure you wrote that joke? I think it's one of Michael Redmond's jokes. And he said he couldn't remember if he'd written it. And it is difficult to remember sometimes if you've had an idea, especially when they occur as thick and fast as they must do in the mind of Joe Pasquale. On an almost biannual basis. And then he said he thought one of his writers might have written it, and it turned out what he meant by writers was not so much people that wrote for him as people that went around writing things down that other comedians had said. But there's a kind of belief amongst the kind of mainstream acts. They say it's not possible to copyright a joke. They say you can't own a joke. So, bearing that in mind, I've tried to write a joke that Joe Pasquale won't be able to steal, right? And it goes like this. Joe Pasquale goes into a bar. He says to the barman, "I'd like a pint of beer, please." And the barman says, "Why don't you just come around the bar, help yourself to the beer, and then walk off without paying for it?" After all, you are Joe Pasquale. Or perhaps send in someone else to steal the beer for you. And then deny that beer can actually be owned. Say that you find the very concept of the ownership of beer hard to understand. Or better still, insist that it is your beer and that you brew it at home in your house. Even though your home lacks the most rudimentary of brewing facilities. Thank you very much indeed.
Woo! Good stuff. So yes, as I say, I watched that for a comedy writing course I did about 10 years ago or more, and that was one of the first times I'd seen Stewart Lee. I think I just said, "Oh, he's very serious," or something like that. But I mean, he's sort of deadpan and serious. But again, what he's done, what he does is he does this brilliantly long setups. That piece is taken from, not sure which, might be 90s comedian or 41st best stand-up. One of those shows, and it's good because it's a long, it's a good 10 minutes, and you sort of have these two ideas in there. But yeah, I mean, that's what he does very well. He sets up a joke with a very long preamble, and along the way he segues off and makes that preamble very funny in itself, and the payoff is just brilliant. I mean, he's got the payoff. He does two payoffs really. He does the story about the endoscopy, which incidentally, if you watch another version of this, he says it's at the Whittington Hospital where I work, which is, amazing. So he does the endoscopy bit, builds up, pays off, mentions Joe Pasquale, then that goes straight into the Joe Pasquale bit. Beautiful, beautifully written, very good. So thank you, and I'll see you next time, and don't go anywhere, alright, wankers? See you next time.